As we've mentioned previously, respiration includes four processes: pulmonary ventilation, the movement of air into and out of the lungs; external respiration, the diffusion of oxygen into the blood and carbon dioxide out of the blood; transport of respiratory gases, using the blood to transport oxygen and carbon dioxide around inside of the body; and internal respiration, the diffusion of oxygen from the blood into the body tissues, and of carbon dioxide from the body tissues into the blood. Here, we want to take a look at diffusion, which is the process that drives both external and internal respiration. Diffusion here is driven by differences in partial pressure gradients. Diffusion has to happen across a respiratory surface, and we need to properly match ventilation rates with perfusion, that is, the flow of blood through a capillary bed. As far as partial pressures go, when we're breathing atmospheric air into the lungs, that atmospheric air has a partial pressure of oxygen that measures about 160 millimeters of mercury. As that air is moving its way down through our respiratory system, however, it's mixing with carbon dioxide and water vapors from the body, and by the time it hits our alveoli, that air is only carrying a partial pressure of oxygen of about 104. However, the pulmonary arteries, that is, those arteries coming from the heart and delivering deoxygenated blood to the lungs, only has a partial pressure of about 40. This means that because there is a higher partial pressure of oxygen in the alveoli, it favors the movement of that oxygen from the alveoli into the blood, so that by the time that blood is moving away from the lungs through the pulmonary veins, it is carrying a fresh load of oxygen and is now at a partial pressure of around 100. As that blood travels by the body tissues, however, body tissues have a much lower partial pressure of oxygen, of around 40. Because the partial pressure of oxygen in the blood is so much higher than that of the body tissue, it favors oxygen rushing out of the blood and into the body tissue. The partial pressures of carbon dioxide are basically the opposite of what we see here. Diffusion has to happen across some kind of surface. The thinner the surface, the faster diffusion can happen. Because of that, our alveoli are lined with a type of tissue called simple squamous epithelia, meaning it's very, very thin. Conditions like pneumonia, with an increase in fluid and mucus and other things, effectively increases this thickness and slows down the diffusion of oxygen from the alveoli into the blood. We also need diffusion to happen against or across a relatively large surface area. If we took all of the alveoli from the lungs and spread them all out, we would see that the total surface area of the lungs is quite massive, about 40 times greater than the surface area of our skin. We can't breathe through our skin the way frogs and salamanders do because we simply don't have enough surface area to allow for the efficient exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide. Conditions like emphysema or tumors in the respiratory system can reduce this surface area and thereby reduce diffusion of oxygen into the body and carbon dioxide out of the body. We also need to nearly match ventilation and perfusion rates. Ventilation is the amount of gas reaching the alveoli, and perfusion refers to the blood flow through a capillary bed. Here, we're looking specifically at the pulmonary capillaries. For optimal gas exchange, we need ventilation and perfusion to be very closely matched with each other, so that the air reaching the alveoli has enough time to diffuse into the blood and get a good saturation with oxygen. If we're not breathing fast enough, or if blood is moving too quickly through the capillary bed, we're not going to be able to get all the oxygen into the blood that we need. Both of these, both ventilation and perfusion, are controlled by autoregulatory mechanisms. Specifically, the partial pressure of oxygen controls perfusion, the blood flow through the capillary bed, by changing the diameter of the arteriole that's at the front of that capillary bed. The partial pressure of carbon dioxide is the one that controls ventilation by changing the diameter of the bronchioles in the bronchial tree of the respiratory system. Let's take a closer look at these autoregulatory mechanisms. Let's say we are experiencing low ventilation rates. If we have low ventilation rates or even increased perfusion, both of those would cause a decline in the oxygen that we are absorbing into the bloodstream because we're not getting enough air into the alveoli, or blood is traveling so quickly it's not picking up that oxygen very well. In either case, that reduction of oxygen causes the arterioles in these pulmonary capillary beds to constrict. As it does so, it reduces blood flow and decreases perfusion. Because we have less oxygen available, we need less perfusion to happen. The opposite is also true. Let's say our problem is low perfusion, that there is low blood flow coming through this capillary bed. That can be caused by increased ventilation, we're moving excess amounts of air, or a decrease in perfusion that's reducing blood flow through the system, or specifically through this capillary bed. In either case, it can cause an increase in oxygen loading into the blood. In this case, the high oxygen content will cause the pulmonary arteries to vasodilate, sending extra blood in through this capillary bed. That will increase the rate of perfusion. As blood goes racing through this capillary bed, there's less time to properly load it with oxygen, and so the oxygen level of the blood leaving this capillary bed can be controlled in this way. Carbon dioxide levels have a somewhat similar effect, but affect bronchioles instead of arterioles. If carbon dioxide levels are high, bronchioles dilate to increase the movement of air and improve the elimination of gases like carbon dioxide. And if carbon dioxide levels are low, the bronchioles can constrict to reduce airflow and increase time for diffusion into the blood or the accumulation of carbon dioxide. Once we have that oxygen into the blood, we need to circulate it through the body and then get that into our body tissues. This is our internal respiration step. Internal respiration is the exchange of gas between the blood and our body tissues. It also relies on differences in partial pressures, just like external respiration did to get oxygen into our blood in the first place. Our body tissues are constantly using molecular oxygen to power cellular respiration. And because of that, the oxygen levels in our body tissues are lower than the oxygen levels in the arterial side of circulation. Here, we can see that the oxygen level, or the partial pressure of oxygen in the body tissues, is only about 40, whereas the partial pressure of oxygen in the artery is about 100. This favors oxygen diffusing out of the blood and into the body tissue, moving down its partial pressure gradient. As those tissues use that molecular oxygen for cellular respiration, they produce carbon dioxide as a byproduct. Carbon dioxide, when it's in a body dissolved in a tissue, or not in a tissue, when carbon dioxide is dissolved in a fluid, it acts like an acid. And we have to get rid of that carbon dioxide before we start to acidify our body fluids. Because the tissues are constantly producing carbon dioxide, there should be a higher level of carbon dioxide in the tissues than there is in the blood. Here, we can see that carbon dioxide levels in the body tissue are about 45 millimeters of mercury, whereas carbon dioxide levels in the arterial side of circulation is about 40. Because we have a higher partial pressure of carbon dioxide in the tissue, carbon dioxide moves down its partial pressure gradient and into the blood. So that blood that's circulating through the venous side of the circulatory system is basically at equilibrium with what was happening in the tissues. We have diffused out oxygen, so the oxygen level on the venous side of circulation is only about 40, and we've diffused in carbon dioxide to match what was happening in the body tissues. So we have a partial pressure of about 45 millimeters of mercury for carbon dioxide on the venous side of circulation. This blood eventually works its way back up towards the lungs, where this whole process of external respiration, transport, and internal respiration can start all over again.